Reading in secondary students. So what does the research say? Well, I'm going to talk about 4 things here. So I'm going to talk about the fact that reading is so very variable in secondary students. I'm going to talk about the idea of a transition slump. I'm going to talk about reading as a secondary issue, and also about the idea that just because students can read doesn't mean that they do. So firstly, what you can see here is some longitudinal data. We've followed students up over time. So this is quite a large group of students, and you can see them represented by individual dots. So 1 dot corresponds to 1 student. Now, in this particular part of the study, we followed them up from year 5 to year 8 as they moved from primary to secondary school. And I think what you can see quite clearly here is the huge variation amongst students, and also that the kind of variation you see in year 5 looks quite similar to the kind of variation that you see in year 8. So what that means is that the knowledge and skills that those students are bringing to whatever task we present them with is quite similar in year 5 and year 8. And yet, of course, the tasks that we might expect them to do might be quite different over time. Now, what I'm going to talk about next is the idea of a transition slump. And actually, we didn't find a transition slump for reading in our data. So instead, I think what's really important to note is that, of course, there is quite a huge shift in challenge and context and expectations as students move from primary to secondary school. So we found that reading knowledge and skills were consistent in a transition summer holiday when we compared that to a non-transition summer holiday. So there's nothing special about transition, and certainly students' reading knowledge and skills isn't going down, so there's no slump. But certainly what we need to do to address any mismatch between the knowledge and skills that students bring and the challenge that comes at them from the texts or the activities that we're asking them to do, we need to have cross-phase discussions and share information about our students so that we can support them across that transition and into secondary school. So reading is absolutely a secondary issue, and it's not just a primary issue. And I think there's a couple of really useful ways of thinking about this. So it's really important to identify reading needs in primary school and to support them in primary school. But what we do see is that some reading needs are very persistent over time. And so we need to continue to support those students as they move through secondary school to make sure they have the best possible outcomes. It is also the case, though, that some reading needs aren't there early on, but emerge only as the challenge of reading increases. Now, if we only looked for reading needs and supported reading needs early, those students would fall through the gaps. So we need to make sure that we continue to identify reading needs and support them all the way through the school system. Now, the final thing I wanted to say really here is that the research is really clear on the fact that just because some students can read, or just because students can read successfully, doesn't mean that they necessarily do. And of course, what we want is for students to enter into this wonderful kind of virtuous circle where they can read, they read well, they do read, and they learn more about reading, they learn more about the curriculum and more about the world. Now, that doesn't necessarily follow, and what we need to have really is an integrated focus on reading proficiency, so how well students can read, and on a kind of rich reading culture to make sure that they can read in their spare time as much as possible. So that might be reading of fiction, it might be non-fiction, it also might be other kinds of texts as well, and it might be digital text too. Thank you.